Good afternoon. My name is Francesca Bregoli. I am the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Center. Thank you so much for joining us for the first of two roundtables on the current debate over the definition of anti-Semitism and its implications for activists, politicians, university officials, and the general public. Today, we are hosting a conversation with three influential scholars at the forefront of the discussion: Kenneth Stern, David Feldman, and Lori Lefkovitz. They are ideally positioned to introduce us to the working definition published in 2005 and later adopted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism published in 2021, and the Nexus definition, likewise, from 2021. After an initial controversy in 2021, the debate on defining anti-Semitism has, of course, been brought back to the attention of the wider public this year after the House passed the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act in the spring. I do want to thank my colleague, Marty Elsky, who first suggested hosting a conversation on this topical and complex issue, and the co-sponsor for the program, the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity. The program will begin with a round of initial prepared remarks from our speakers, followed by a conversation that will explore some of the key differences between the definitions, and at the end, we will conclude with a selection of questions from the public at home. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to introduce all speakers together in the order in which they will present their initial remarks. Kenneth Stern is an award-winning author and attorney and the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate, a program of the Human Rights Project at Bard College. Before joining Bard, he was executive director of the Justice and Caring Rosenberg Foundation from 2014 to 2018. And before that, he was director of the Division on Anti-Semitism and Extremism at the American Jewish Committee, where he worked for 25 years. He has argued before the US Supreme Court, testified before Congress, and was an invited presenter at the White House Conference on Hate Crimes. His newest book is The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israel-Palestine Camps Debate, which came out for the New Jewish Press in 2020. Mr. Stern was the lead drafter of the working definition on anti-Semitism. David Feldman is the director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism and a professor of history at Birkbeck, University of London. He specializes in the history of anti-Semitism, Jewish history, the history of racialization, and the history of migration in modern Britain. Professor Feldman is also actively engaged in research which addresses public policy and led a pan-European project exploring contemporary anti-Semitism in Western Europe. He has advised international, European, and British institutions on policy issues connected with anti-Semitism, including the United Nations, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and Human Rights Watch. His most recent book is Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and the Politics of Definition, which came out for Palgrave in 2023, and he is one of the authors of the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. Lori Lefkovitz is a professor of English and Jewish Studies. She holds the Ruderman Chair in Jewish Studies at Northeastern University, where she also directs the Jewish Studies program. Before joining Northeastern, she held a chair in gender and Judaism at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College and was the founding director of Kolot, the Center for Jewish Women and Gender Studies, the first such center at a rabbinical seminary. She is widely published in the fields of literature, critical theory, and Jewish women's studies, serves on editorial, professional, and community boards, and lectures widely in academic and Jewish contexts. She is the author and editor of several books, most recently In Scripture, The First Stories of Jewish Sexual Identity, which came out for Rowman and Littlefield in 2010, and she is a member of the Nexus Task Force. Thank you so much for joining us. Ken, David, and Lori, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francesca. I guess I'm going first. I want to say it's an honor to be with you and with Lori, whose work I respect and admire, and David too. David and I actually co-taught a course. So it's great to have this conversation. So I want to give a little bit of outline for how the IHRA definition came about and problems that I see with it. And I have a whole chapter in my book on this, but in short, what happened is at the time of the Second Intifada, there was an uptick like we're seeing now when things happen in the Middle East with attacks on Jews, particularly in Europe, the United States too, but Europe was more of a continuing problem. And there was a group called the EUMC that was tasked with doing reports on hatred, anti-Semitism, racism, Islamophobia, so forth. And it put out a report in 2004 that was actually pretty decent in terms of what it found. It found attacks on Jews and Jewish institutions, not just by the traditional suspects of the far right, but by some young Arab and Muslim folks on the outskirts of Paris and other. So it found the facts. I thought pretty well. But there were two problems with it, one of which it identified. It said, look, we have all these different data collectors in Bratislava and Kyiv and all these other places in Europe, and there's no single song sheet to tell them what to put in and what to not put in a report on the sort of temperature of anti-Semitism. And they said, well, we'll have a temporary thing until we sort of figure this out. And that was a list of stereotypes about Jews, which you can argue about. To me, that's a function of what anti-Semitism is as opposed to its defining characteristic, but that's what they said. But there was a subtext, I thought, in that too, because they tackled the question, what do you do if a Jew is attacked as a stand-in for an Israeli? Is that something that should be counted or not? And they came up with, in my view, this convoluted idea that if the person had these stereotypes about Jews, applied them to Israelis, reapplied them to the poor guy or woman who was in front of them on a European street, that's anti-Semitism. But if they were upset with an action of the state of Israel and attacked that same Jew, lamentable, but not anti-Semitism. And I'm thinking, in the United States, I grew up in the 50s and 60s. If a Black person was lynched because somebody had these racist stereotypes, that's racism. But if they were upset at the Civil Rights Act being passed or a Martin Luther King speech and attacked the same poor person, that's not. So it happened that the leader of EUMC was invited by a colleague to come and speak at the AJC, American Jewish Committee, annual meeting in DC in May of 2004. And a few weeks beforehand, there was a Montreal Jewish day school that was firebombed in retaliation for the Israeli assassination of a Hamas leader. Not anti-Semitism, according to that. So staff, you're not supposed to challenge people publicly. That's what sort of like lay people get the chance to speak. I got up there and I went through the definition and I said, how is this not included? So she, with my other AJC colleagues, we agreed to come up with the definition, and worked. My colleague Andy Baker was the one doing most of the politicking. I was doing the drafting, and brought a team together. Yehuda Bauer, Michael Berenbaum, people from the Jewish communities in the UK and Australia and elsewhere. And the driving force behind it was mostly to be useful for these data collectors. There were examples about Israel there because we saw a correlation with some things about Israel and the attacks on Jews. And remember, this is also 2004 we're doing this. This is a couple of years after the Durban conference, which was trying to revitalize in many ways the Zionism, racism UN resolution. So it was put together with that primarily in mind. One of the things that I think that's been overlooked in the debate is that there was very clear language intentionally in it on how to think about hate crime. Because the U.S. has basically, it's a case called Wisconsin v. Mitchell, Supreme Court case, that makes it clear that a hate crime isn't just prosecuting somebody for hate. It's a question of somebody is being selected to be a victim of a crime based on who they are. It doesn't matter the motive. So, we saw in France, there was a debate, well, when a Jew was kidnapped and held for ransom, well, that's a positive stereotype. Jews are rich, right? So could that be anti-Semitism? Or in the UK, they sort of default to asking the victim group to do the first pass on how to think about this as hate crime. I wanted to have clear language that said no, like the Montreal situation. If you target a Jew because they're Jewish or a Jewish institution, that's it. It doesn't matter what they really think about Jews, is the intentional selection. Then what happened? In 2010 in the United States, the Department of Education made a clarification on something called Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that act protects students from pervasively hostile campus environment, so pervasive that you're basically denied an education. And it didn't include religion as a category, race and so forth. So there was a clarification that Jews and Sikhs and Muslims as ethnicities should be protected under Title VI. And I thought, great. I approved of that. Actually, I was the complainant for some Jewish high school students outside of New York City, where there was a Kick a Jew Day and swastikas on backpacks, and the school did nothing. This was a good tool, right? So, but what happened was that people on the right of the pro-Israel Jewish community decided, let's take this definition and wed it to this new power and go after things that are happening on campus. And there were some things happening on campus, shoving, spitting, those types of things, clearly appropriate for consideration under Title VI. But they were starting to talk about classes that were being taught, speakers that were coming in, texts that were being assigned, and so forth. And to me, that's a clear violation of academic freedom. All the suits that they brought lost. Kenneth Marcus of the Brandeis Center, I thought, was very honest and said, well, even when the suits lost, it basically had a chilling effect on some speech which he didn't like. And I don't like much of the speech either, but he thought administrators were going to worry about lawsuits. He tried to get it institutionalized in various colleges. That didn't happen. They brought it to the United States Senate at the end of 2016, called the Antisemitism Awareness Act. It was passed unanimously. And if you look at the background material, it basically supported suppressing speech. It said, look, there's a professor that was suspended for tweeting something that was anti-Muslim. It was a film that was not allowed to be shown because some students thought it was, the professor was anti-gay. The film was anti-Muslim, but it protect us too. Stalled in the House. Under President Trump, he signed an executive order that said the definition had to be considered under Title VI. And there was clear language from Jared Kushner, the son-in-law and special advisor, who said, our policy is Zionism, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, full stop. So what have we seen since that? We've seen it used against programs in colleges. We've seen it used in lawsuits. We've seen it against administrators. In Florida, which passed a law adopting the definition, in June, there was just a recent edict to the state schools that they had to do a word search for words like Zionism, Israel, Palestine, and so forth in courses to be reviewed to see if they're balanced. To me, I testified in front of the Senate 2 days ago. I put in a footnote that basically said, how is this different than if you look at the case of Sweezy versus New Hampshire, which is back at the time of the McCarthy era, when they were looking at a professor teaching, are you teaching dialectical materialism? Are you teaching about communism? This is the same. And that's how it's being used. In Germany, it has been adopted, and there was an article that I also have in the testimony, if anybody wants it, it's on the Senate Judiciary website. It's in a footnote, but that the language was being used to describe Jews in Germany who may consider themselves anti-Zionist as anti-Semites. And somebody quoted in the article said, once again, Germany defines who is a Jew, right? The irony that the German state would actually classify who is a Jew, what's a legitimate Jewish position, and how Jews should react is just beneath contempt. And here, it's also a contentious issue, to me, on church-state issues. Most Jews are Zionist, but there's a growing number of Jews, young Jews in particular, who are either agnostic about Zionism or anti-Zionist, and sometimes their Judaism leads them to that position. I don't want the state to decide that. Two other points, and then I'll turn it over. One is that when I was at AJC, one of the first things I did with a bunch of different college presidents was to talk about how do you deal with anti-Semitism and hatred on campus. And one of the things that was just a cardinal rule is no speech codes. It blinds you to all the things you can do. There are some wonderful things, and we can talk about them in terms of models of teaching, training, and so forth. But when you say thou shalt not say certain things, either by law or by sort of fiat, that's a problem and actually undermines the attempt to deal with anti-Semitism and other things. Second thing is, as I run a Center for the Study of Hate, one of the things that we know about hate, especially when we get into these us versus them buckets, is people crave simplicity, they crave certainty, they crave symbols, and I think IHRA has in many ways become a symbol, of whether you support fighting anti-Semitism or not. And I think that's disastrous to have it around. And frankly, I don't think any of we could talk about the differences in the definitions. I don't think any of them should be used as a speech code. And finally, that this is about speech. When it passed the House, it was interesting. You had people that opposed it, that you would expect, some liberal Zionists like Jerry Nadler. Marjorie Taylor Greene opposed it too. Why did she oppose it? She opposed it because one of the examples that could be used to look about whether this is something that a data collector should include about speech about Israel was the question about deicide. And she said, wait a minute, the Gospels teach the Jews killed Jesus, and this would criminalize, the Gospels. And of course it wouldn't, but her point was well taken, that so this is about speech, right? So Senator Marshall said, I'll support the legislation because I'm against anti-Semitism, but I'm going to put an amendment in to strike out that one thing. I can't imagine a better admission that this is really about speech you don't like and using instruments of state. And that's the problem. It was intended to help data collected. It was helped to have clarity. It had some diplomatic purposes, but it's being used for entirely different ways. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Ken. David.
Thank you, Francesca. And thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here today. I'll begin with two apologies. One is that we have some internet problems here as well, so I hope my connection holds up and you're able to hear me. And secondly, just as Ken was stopping speaking, I managed to put my pages out of order. So if I come to an ugly halt at some point, that will be the reason why. But let me begin. Preparing for what is my afternoon, I went back through my emails and saw that it was on the 1st of December 2019 that I was invited to take part in a workshop that was being planned for the summer of 2020 to discuss definitions of anti-Semitism. So this was my first involvement in the project that eventuated in the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. Of course, something happened between the 1st of December 2019 and the summer of 2020, and that was COVID, and the workshop never took place. Now, in most respects, as we know, COVID was a terrible thing, but from the point of view of the JDA, it was a great blessing, because it soon became clear to me, at least, that the plan that we had, that in a 3-day workshop, we would resolve the differences among ourselves and come with a new definition of anti-Semitism, was completely pie in the sky. So what in fact happened was, from some point, I think in the summer of 2020 through to the beginning of 2021, there were a series of online meetings between a group of academics in which we were able to come to a view among ourselves that we could all agree with. So who were we? We were about 25 people, academics, drawn from Jewish studies, anti-Semitism studies, Holocaust studies, and Middle East studies. Eventually, out of this larger group came a core group who were responsible for the drafting of the JDA, and out of this core group, and I was a member of that core group, but then 2 or 3 people were responsible for the fine-tuning and for the guidelines and so forth. And I was not part of that group. So why did we meet? I think there were three concerns that we shared. First, the way in which legitimate criticism of Israel was becoming decried and denounced as anti-Semitic. Secondly, the ways in which the cause of fighting anti-Semitism was becoming separated from the cause of fighting racism more broadly. And thirdly, we were concerned by the persistence, the chronic, and at times the critical nature of anti-Semitism in the societies in which we lived in the diaspora, and the need to combat it more clearly and more effectively. So these three causes for concern existed independently of the IHRA working definition, but they were also crystallized by the IHRA working definition. And Ken has just explained the reasons why, in the US context, these concerns were crystallized by the use and abuse of the IHRA working definition, and certainly the same goes for Europe. After the EUMC definition that Ken spoke about had been adopted by the IHRA in 2016, and then the UK government was the first state to adopt the definition. So we were meeting because of the traction that had been gained by the IHRA working definition. Numbers of governments and civil society bodies were adopting it. In the UK, universities were coming under great pressure from the government. Most universities receive recognition and some funding from government, but it was able to exert this pressure on universities to adopt the IHRA working definition. And we were troubled by its inherent weakness as a definition, its misguidedness in attaching anti-Semitism to the defense of the interests of a state, i.e. Israel, and to the prosecution, its attachment to the prosecution of injustice in Israel and Palestine. And we believe that it thereby weakened the position of Jews in the diaspora and actually made them more, not less, vulnerable to anti-Semitism. So it was in this context that we set about designing a new definition. And I don't think it was the life's ambition of any of us to design a definition of anti-Semitism, and it was we were there, I suppose, in an effort of a sort of civic engagement. Now, some people might wish we hadn't bothered and we'd stayed at home and tended to our garden, but those were our motives. So what does the definition do? Well, first of all, it presents a straightforward, clear definition of anti-Semitism as a starting point. Anti-Semitism, it says, is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews, or Jewish institutions as Jewish. Secondly, it places this definition within a framework of documents that set forward universal, i.e. generalizable principles. Again, something that the IHRA definition does not do. The IHRA definition treats anti-Semitism as an issue out on its own. The JDA places it as one variant within a family, one element within a family of racism. So it places it alongside the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 1969 Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, among other documents. It's explicitly presented as a response that has caused confusion controversy and weaken the fight against anti-Semitism. And it introduces a set of guidelines that accompany the definition. There are 15 guidelines in all, and I'll just say 3 things about them. One, the guidelines set out the characteristics of what it calls classical anti-Semitism, especially the association of Jews with conspiracy and metaphysical evil, and it insists that the application of these tropes, of these ideas to Israel is also anti-Semitic. Secondly, it gives examples and cases which are not on the face of it anti-Semitic, but sometimes are said to be so. So one example, an important example of this is that the guidelines say it is not anti-Semitic to support arrangements between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea that accord full equality to all inhabitants in whatever constitutional form. In other words, that it's not anti-Semitic to imagine a different set of constitutional arrangements between the river and the sea. And in this way, the definition keeps open a space for discussion and debate, for free speech, which the IHRA working definition and its implementation and other influences as well have been seeking to close down and label those discussions anti-Semitic. Thirdly, and as far as personally, this is crucial, the definition shifts our understanding of anti-Semitism back firmly to the rights of Jewish people and not to the interests of a state. Crucially, it includes the rights of Jewish people in Israel. It says it is anti-Semitic to deny Jewish people in Israel the right to flourish individually and collectively with the principle of equality, but it endows the people with those rights and not the state itself. So the JDA was launched in March 2021, and it's important for me to say that it presents itself as an educational document, not as a speech code. And I think the authors had hopes for the document, but not excessive hopes. I mean, as a historian myself, and as a historian who has written about the ways in which time, I, of all people, ought to be aware that antisemitism is not going to withstand change over time. It will be good for a while, but not forever. Some leftist voices have criticized the JDA as an attempt to police discourse and activism. They've criticized it as the IHRA light. It's also been denounced by mainstream Jewish figures and centrist and right-wing supporters of Israel as a wrecking document. That term, a wrecking document, I think is more one that comes from the right. And there are interesting conspiracy theories put forward by, for example, Gerald Steinberg, who sees the JDA as an emanation of German ultra-leftists. And obviously this is just a transparent attempt to smear the efforts of those who put the declaration together rather than to argue with it. But representative Jewish institutions have not taken it up. And this is important. Obviously, it's an important limitation on what we have achieved. But it's also important to understand or to ask the question, as Ken raised earlier, who do these institutions represent? There are growing numbers of Jews outside of them. The growing detachment of Jews in Israel and the United Kingdom, the growing detachment of Jews from Israel in the United States and the United Kingdom is evidenced by the most reputable attitudinal surveys by Pew and by Jewish Policy Research in the UK. Above all, the JDA has been welcomed by those who are able to walk and chew gum, by those who are able to keep two ideas in their head at once, people who want to oppose anti-Semitism and who also want to oppose the cumulative injustices which have been heaped upon Palestinians. And here the JDA has been strongly welcomed. I'll just give two examples and then close. One is that I was recently having a conversation with a very senior university administrator who explained to me, well, of course, we have adopted the IHRA definition because we felt we had to. We came under pressure to do so. But we always interpret it with the JDA beside it so that we can keep on the right track, because there's a recognition precisely that the JDA keeps open a space for academic freedom and freedom of speech. Secondly, in my work here in London with colleagues, I teach a course called Facing Antisemitism, and we teach this course to a variety of groups, including trade unions. Trade unionists who are eager to support Palestinian claims for rights, but also almost entirely eager to avoid falling into anti-Semitism. And it's in these contexts that I think the JDA has been especially welcomed and has been especially useful as a tool. And I'll close there.
Thank you, David. And I just want to bring the attention of the public at home to the chat where I've been posting links to the various definitions. Lori, please.
Thank you, Francesca, and thanks for organizing this important informational session. I've already learned a lot from my distinguished colleagues on the panel. And I'm grateful for opportunities to speak with people who are taking seriously the full range of manifestations of anti-Semitism, which have been exacerbated in our current political climate and in the face of heartbreaking world events. I joined the Nexus task force in large measure because I valued the chance to contribute and to clarify my own thinking by engaging with people who were expert in the study of anti-Semitism and with whom the places of consensus and the fault lines would be made more visible in our own fraught moment. But that said, I'm a relative latecomer to this party, and I joined with Nexus, which is also, which I think was in sort of parallel play with those who drafted the Jerusalem Declaration. It was sort of happening coincidentally in the literal sense in the 1921. But we also are a group of some 20-odd academics and practitioners under the leadership of Jonathan Jacoby. And I joined relatively recently, well after the Nexus document and the white paper on which it is based were published. So as I understand it, its deep origin goes back really as early as 2015, when Jonathan Jacoby became interested in the progressive community's apparent avoidance of the subject of Israel, especially in policy conversations, for fear of being accused of anti-Semitism. And in the following years, Jonathan and Diane Winston at the Annenberg School at USC created a task force to study the intersection of Israel and anti-Semitism, that is specifically that intersection. And that group issued a white paper called Understanding Anti-Semitism at its nexus with Israel and Zionism, which then became a basis for the Nexus document. When the Biden administration was drafting its national strategy to counter anti-Semitism, it included the Nexus document as a complement to IHRA, stating that multiple viewpoints are valuable for understanding anti-Semitism so it can be addressed more effectively. So like the Jerusalem Declaration, which I think is a carefully worded and very important definition, the Nexus document was developed in response to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism because of the sense that how it represented the relationship between anti-Semitism and Israel was being manipulated in exactly the ways we've been hearing about by political forces, with the effect of dividing us from one another and dividing us within important coalitions. And I think that's maybe something we want to explore further. Unlike the Jerusalem Declaration, the Nexus document is not intended to be an alternative definition for adoption by any official bodies. It's rather meant to function as a commentary, to add nuance, to promote understanding specifically at that one nexus. It doesn't take a broad view on questions of anti-Semitism. It's about that nexus. And importantly, also, the Nexus document is intended as a guide for American policymakers and American community leaders specifically. It's not, it doesn't have this global reach of the other documents. So one concern that motivated this project was the need to liberate lawmakers in America, to influence the Netanyahu government and support the best interests of Israel as they understood them, without being vulnerable to misplaced accusations of anti-Semitism. There was a concern, I think there's still a concern, that any and all critical responses to the actions of the Israeli government were susceptible to being labeled anti-Semitic, and thereby weaponizing the accusation of anti-Semitism to stifle legitimate conversation and critique. And here I think you're hearing an echo chamber among us. We've all said this. The document supports free speech and robust political debate. As a group with different political views among ourselves, and when we're in conversation, that's evident, we recognize that many people, including Jewish people, and Ken said this, object to actions of the Israeli government and would wish to see America positively influence Israel. Stifling speech with false accusations of anti-Semitism cheapens the use of the term, and I think that's really an important point, and makes people less sensitive to, less outraged by, and less motivated to combat actual anti-Semitism. And here I want to be specific, such as the aggressive expression of white supremacy that is increasingly visible and expressed out in the open. Yeah, we can come back to that. So criticism of Israel, the Nexus document does specify, can be anti-Semitic. And it specifies multiple examples of myths, attitudes, and behaviors that should rightfully be considered and treated as anti-Semitic with respect to Israel. And I'm just going to specify some of those so people have the examples in their heads. And I'm just excerpting here. Characterizing Israel as being part of a sinister world conspiracy of Jewish control of the media, economy, government, or other financial, cultural, or societal institutions is anti-Semitic. It participates in old canards, right? Indiscriminately blaming suffering and injustices around the world on a hidden Jewish conspiracy, or being or the maligning hand of Israel or Zionists. That's anti-Semitic. Holding individuals or institutions because they are Jewish culpable of real or imagined wrongdoing committed by Israel, anti-Semitic. Considering Jews to be a priori incapable of setting aside their loyalty to the Jewish people or to Israel. Denigrating or denying the Jewish identity of certain Jews because they are perceived as holding the wrong position on Israel. So, of course, anti-Semitic to attack or physically harm a Jew because of his or her relationship to Israel, conveying intense hostility towards the Jews who are connected to Israel in a way that provokes violence, anti-Semitic to treat Israel in a negative manner based on a claim that Jews alone should be denied the right to define themselves as a people or to exercise any form of self-determination. That, I think, already is a more nuanced claim, maybe something that we would want to go back to. And in fact, members of the group are in conversation about that detail in the Nexus document. The document says it's anti-Semitic to advocate a political solution that denies Jews the right to define themselves as a people, denying them, because they are Jews, the right to self-determination, or to deny them the right to physical safety and full human, civil, religious, and I would maybe add equal rights. So the document also says, and this is the last example I'll give, that it's anti-Semitic to treat Israel differently solely because it is a Jewish state, using standards different than those that are applied to other countries. So elsewhere in the document, it does specify that paying disproportionate attention to Israel is not prima facie anti-Semitic, and there are many legitimate reasons for doing so. Maybe because Israel's very important to you, or maybe because your family was personally displaced in 1948, or because America has a special relationship with Israel. So it tries to hold that balance between those two claims. So the document recognizes that speech can be offensive and wrong or otherwise objectionable, even if it's not anti-Semitic. So it, again, trying to nuance the definition. In some places, the Nexus document, I would say, just to be comparative, has less conviction around some issues than the Jerusalem Declaration, such as the question of whether BDS is anti-Semitic, where the Jerusalem Declaration indicates categorically that it is a legitimate form of protest, and Nexus indicates that it's context dependent, not inevitably anti-Semitic. But again, I would underscore that having these conversations rather than stifling them is what's important. The Nexus Task Force recently developed a guide for campuses designed for administrators and others to assess claims of anti-Semitism in the context of protests against the war on Gaza. Here too, the goal is to distinguish free speech from hate speech. Finally, these Nexus documents emphasize that criticism of Israel or opposition to Zionism should not be deemed anti-Semitic categorically, but the details of the document indicate the importance of assessing context, impact, and intention when making determinations about anti-Semitism. So I would close by saying that personally, my struggle is that these three critical areas, context, impact, and intent, are not always readily ascertainable. It's hard to determine someone's intent, and I'm on a campus. Many of us are using language differently from one another, from the river to the sea, for example, including slogans that are variously interpreted, such that we are often speaking past each other. So Nexus opens with the proviso that all claims of anti-Semitism, like all claims of discrimination, should be honored and taken seriously, reminding us implicitly that expressions of racism are interconnected. And I would add that anti-Semitism in any form or circumstance is intolerable. As an educator, I hope that we can find ways to be maximally effective in teaching about how pernicious anti-Semitism has been and continues to be. And again, personally, I want to say that anti-Semitism, such as the now widely held Great Replacement theory, which I think is a really important thing for us to be alert to, is a relatively new iteration of, it's actually not very new, but it's prominent right now, of time-honored anti-Semitic canards, and it terrifies me. Because Nexus was created as a guide for American policymakers and focuses on instances when criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic, Nexus may seem, because of this emphasis, I'm hearing David's wrecking ball, to be most often deployed in order to dismiss false claims of anti-Semitism. So I would want to emphasize that that purposeful agenda should never be used to minimize anti-Semitism or attitudes, conditions, or behaviors that negatively affect the Jewish people, and Jewish people in particular. And yeah, I think you can open it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Before we open it to the public, I just wanted to ask a few questions to begin the conversation. And I wanted to, Lori, it really is a segue from many of the points that you were raising about the specificity of the Nexus definition and its understanding of the ways in which anti-Semitism can be linked to the issue of Israel and Zionism or not. So I would like to ask all of you to explain in a more granular way the main differences between the three definitions, particularly when it comes to the themes of Israel and Zionism. And one of the one of the points on which the IHRA definition has become on the one hand, favored by political entities, but also controversial among academics, is the vagueness of its elaboration on the ways, on the intersections of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So I'd like to understand a little better, and I'm sure the public at home would love to understand a little better, the ways in which the texts of the definitions deal specifically with the issue of Israel and anti-Zionism. Starting with Ken, please.
Sure, thanks. So as I said, when it was created, the major purpose of it was these bean counters in different European countries for reports. It also had the purpose of clarifying about hate crimes. It also had a purpose of giving diplomats some language to point to. When Iran talks about wiping Israel off the map, they can talk to another diplomat and point to some language and explain why that's anti-Semitic. The examples about Israel were there because we saw then, as we're seeing now, when certain expressions are being made, that ties into the temperature where there could be hate crimes against Jews. And that was the major reason. It was never intended to be a speech code. And one thing that I've learned from watching from 2010 on until, and thank you, David, for pointing out that the same text was adopted by IHRA in 2016. That's why it's called that now as opposed to the EUMC one. That it's become just this tool to try to suppress speech. So to give you an example from the UK, right? So this was a few years ago. There was an Israel Apartheid Week event on a campus. As David correctly pointed out, the UK adopted the definition. They were told they can't have it. And what did the Simon Wiesenthal Center do in the United States? They put out a press release saying, this is great. Every campus should use this to ban it. So that's, to me, it's not the question of how the definitions differ. It's that this is a political battle. Tools are being weaponized. People saw in the definition a tool to abuse, to go after speech they don't like about Israel. I mean, nobody in the United States is saying, gee, former President Trump has dinner with Kanye West and a Holocaust denier. Let's consult a definition of anti-Semitism, any of them, to see if that should be something that's clarified as anti-Semitic. To Laurie's point, it becomes ubiquitous when you basically try to filter things. Is it anti-Semitism? Is it not? And you want to put it online. The reality is, and with this, I'll stop about this. At its most significant, and all the definitions have this, anti-Semitism is conspiracy theory that Jews are trying to harm humanity and giving an explanation for what goes wrong in the world. And when that, cuts and pastes Zionists and Jews, that's clear. There are reasons why one can be anti-Zionist that have nothing to do with anti-Semitism. And there's a lot in the gray area. And what people are trying to do is use the definitions to say, okay, you could either exculpate or indict, when the reality is most things, but you're looking at intent, you're looking at effect, you're looking at all these different things, actually play out in the real world much differently.
Thank you. David, would you like to jump in?
Sure, thank you, Francesca. Well, the JDA is pretty straightforward here. Criticizing or opposing Zionism as a form of nationalism is not, on the face of it, anti-Semitic. And I think that what is crucial for the JDA are the rights of Jews, as I tried to explain before, not the prerogatives of the state. And I think it's important as well, clear what we're talking about here. We're actually not talking about a blueprint for a peaceful and prosperous future between the river and the sea for all the peoples there. We're talking about what is and what is not anti-Semitic. We're not talking about what is sensible, what is practical. Even things can be foolish, things can be impractical. I might find something offensive, and yet it might tick all of those boxes and still not be anti-Semitic. So I think we need to name things for what they are. We can have all number of different opinions about anti-Zionism, and the drafters of the JDA among themselves had a variety of opinions, but it's not in itself anti-Semitic, whatever one thinks about it.
And Lori.
So Francesca, I hear your question, which is that you want us to, locate the fine points of distinction among us. And I also hear in my colleagues' responses the difficulty of doing so. I think there is not a lot of light between us. We agree with each other, and I would say some of the differences are, in fact, the order in which these documents were composed and the purposes for which they were composed. So the Nexus document doesn't aim to be a full definition, and I think in that way it's different. It aims to influence policymakers or not influence them, because like David, we don't take a stand on what the correct political solution is to millennia of conflict in the region. We are, I think, we're a tool for those policymakers, lawmakers, community leaders that want to enter this difficult terrain when you have a Jewish community that's divided against itself, that often, and I'm speaking more politically, I think, than my colleagues, that often is trying to influence the conversation at the policy level. And for those of us who have been, I speak now as an academic, in lifelong coalition with with people who are involved in all kinds of anti-racist efforts, and want to have colleagues that support me and Jews on campus when there are actual expressions of anti-Semitism, that we are finding ourselves being sundered from one another, because I'm looking at what's happening on campus now, when when everything raises the accusation of anti-Semitism. And so I think that's a place where Nexus has a very particular purpose that's a little bit different, or a little bit on the tangential to that of the other two documents. And I would say there are nuances on that are different. So I mentioned in my opening remarks that BDS is one of them. I think the Jerusalem Declaration was pretty categorical. It's a legitimate form of political speech, and I think we would say, well, maybe not always. Sometimes that, and I personally, it makes me bristle. Does that make me? Is it ever anti-Semitic? I'm thinking maybe it is. But that feels to me like possibly, a distinction without a difference in the end. That that maybe what we need to be talking about is are sort of the sticky places we're finding ourselves right now. But yeah, I don't think I have a lot more to say about the places of difference. Our document is shorter than the Jerusalem document.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If I could add just one more point about the weaponization, I mean, so in the IHRA definition, it talks about double standards related to Israel, right? So, and the drafting of that, the thinking was, okay, if Canada was bombing Buffalo, nobody would say Americans should do nothing, right? So that was the thinking of the double standard. So my point is that the text doesn't matter, it's weaponized. So how has it been weaponized? Saying, well, if you don't criticize all these other authoritarian countries, but criticize Israel, that's a double standard and that's anti-Semitic. And my response to that is, back when I was protesting for Soviet Jews, I happened not to go into the Tibet demonstrations. Does that make me anti-Tibetan? So the point for me is not the Talmudic differences on the text, but how the language is being used in a political battle and distorted out of all reality.
Thank you for the clarification. David.
Yes, I mean, I'll just come back and I'll both agree with Laurie and disagree with Laurie. I'll agree with her where she says the differences between the Nexus document and the JDA are very often ones of nuance, which is why I disagree with her that she somehow thinks that the JDA is gung-ho in favor of BDS, or gives BDS under all circumstances a clean bill of health. It says BDS is not on the face of it in itself anti-Semitic, but that it could, in some instances, take anti-Semitic forms or be promoted in anti-Semitic ways. Is certainly something that I would agree with, but the idea that it is inherently anti-Semitic is something that I would strongly oppose. So, as I say, I think we agree and disagree.
I'm not sure we disagree. I think I was reaching for something in the language that was where ours was more mildly articulated, but in the end, yeah, that may also be a point of agreement.
So I wanted to ask.
I'm a historian and you're a literary scholar, so understand nuances of language.
I wanted to ask another question in light of the current spike of anti-Semitic incidents in the US, Europe, and the UK. How well do you think these definitions have fared? And here I want to connect it with the question that we have in the chat from Joseph Rosenstein, who's asking, might it be possible to write a definition of anti-Semitism that combines the strengths of the three statements and avoids their weaknesses? Of course, Joseph doesn't clarify what the strengths and the weaknesses are, but right, in your mind, is it possible to come up with a definition that would achieve that sort of medium, that golden mean of trying to convey a strong action plan against anti-Semitism, and while at the same time protecting the freedom of speech on campuses? And
yeah, if you want me to take that, the short answer is no. There are other definitions out there too. I think the Independent Jewish Voice is one that actually preceded the JDA one out of Canada. It's not a bad definition. And if you look at the national strategy on anti-Semitism, it was really interesting. For those of you who may not recall, the organized Jewish community was pushing the Biden White House. You have to center everything around IHRA. Everything has to be from IHRA. If you look at the document, it has one sentence about, one paragraph, excuse me, about definitions. It uses the past tense to say the government has embraced IHRA, mentions Nexus specifically, welcomed other definitions. And then it said, we're not really talking about definitions. We're talking about an action plan. What are we going to do for the whole of society? How are we going to use our agencies and so forth? So, I don't think that there's a way to put everything together, other than to say the commonality of the all three, again, is that its worst anti-Semitism is conspiracy theory. That gives an explanation for what goes wrong in the world. But to underscore the point, there's a comfort in thinking, there's an easy tool we're going to use to decide what is and what isn't. And I'm saying we have to be comfortable with a lot of stuff in the gray area. We have to be, comfortable with thinking about how we look at anti-Semitism with a wide lens, how people get pushed into these social movements. One of the things I testified about a couple of days ago in front of the Senate was that, we could all agree that anti-Semitism is a canary in the coal mine for the health of democracy. I pointed out that the flip side is also true, that when you vilify immigrants, transgender people, Muslims, and so forth. That's a conveyor belt to anti-Semitic thinking. People at Charlottesville were chanting, "Jews will not replace us," because to them, why they were losing in their minds to, as whites, to people of color, was because of this Jewish conspiracy. So as we narrow it down into, is this about Israel? Is this about anti-Semitic? Is it not? We're losing so much. It actually is of much more importance in the moment.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that Ken's last point for me is salient. That what's good, I think, about coming up with definitions and talking about these details of definitions, which may seem like the academics playing in their sandbox, is that what we're modeling is conversation and the possibility of conversation. And where I feel most demoralized is, and again on my own campus, is how easy it is to shut conversation down. And that, I'll give an example on the other side. If the vocabulary of genocide, Israel's committing a genocide in Gaza. I mean, terrible things are happening in the world, but that language has been used to create a binary such that there's no space for conversation. If this is a genocide, you're complicit or you're against it. And trying to have a conversation about what's going on in its details and, and agree that there's all kinds of pain on all sides, that Israel has formidable enemies, however you want to take that conversation, is very hard to do if conversation itself is shut down. Ken, I think, emphasized the other side of the shutting down of conversation, and that is, I mean, you asked, like, what, will definitions help? I think they help insofar as they are catalysts, and catalysts that in the case of the Nexus document, really the purpose is to say, feel free to speak. We're not going to yell anti-Semitism. I think we do have, we have an election happening, and we're being, a little, well, I don't want to be coy. I mean, I think the solution is to elect Kamala Harris and not Donald Trump, that's the solution to, or one step in the right direction in terms of squelching a kind of white supremacy that includes anti-Semitism that is, that we're seeing not just in the United States, but globally. And that, when we have a skittish Jewish community that feels as if, that gives credence to right-wing claims that the right is somehow stronger, better on Israel, and therefore, hold your nose and support them. I would want us to intervene in those claims.
If I could just say three things. I think the desire for the perfect definition misses something. And what it misses is that even the best definition, which of course is the JDA, so even the JDA depends on being used with intelligence and good faith. It's a tool. And I know of at least one occasion where the JDA has been used or misused. So even if we came up with a perfect definition, it wouldn't be proof against that. So we have to be modest or realistic in what we can expect a definition to do. Secondly, as Ken said, rightly said, these definitions, especially the IHRA, has become a symbol. Irrespective of what it says, it has become a totem for those who want to say that anti-Zionism or severe criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. And that's not a position that it's possible to triangulate. And the last thing I want to say about this is that I think we have to reconcile ourselves to the inevitability of debate and uncertainty about this, because as I think all of the definitions or statements that we're discussing say, and if they don't say, they imply, context is always important, and context is always debated. It's not always, there's always room for disagreement there, and and so people of good faith and good intentions will not always agree at the boundary, and that's something we will have to live with. And that's why it's important, as Ken would say, to protect freedom of speech through this.
So I think this is it's a nice moment to segue to some of the questions from the public at home, and in line with the issue of context, I want to bring up feelings, the emotions that many students, faculty, staff feel when the question of anti-Semitism is raised, and feeling unsafe on campus has been a theme that I think many of us on US, European, UK campuses have been dealing with. And I want to bring your attention to two questions in the chat, one from CB and one from Bluma Zuckerbrot Finkelstein. So CB is saying, I'm a Jewish student working as part of my University Palestine network. We have asked our institution to consider formally adopting the JDA definition as a resource to interpret the IHRA definition that they adopted in 2020. We have been told that there are multiple Jewish Israeli staff who feel unsafe because of this. Do you have any advice on how we could move forward? And then the question from Bluma Zuckerbrot Finkelstein, practically, how do we balance context, impact, and intention, especially as Lori noted, it's difficult to get at intention. With racism and other forms of hate/discrimination, we bow to the members of the ethnic group themselves to tell us the trigger words or phrases that make them feel unsafe or discriminated against. It seems that when it comes to the Jews, we don't apply the same standards. If From the River to the Sea makes many Jews feel unsafe, and many Jews understand it as a call to violence, and it comes with the context of an anti-Israel protest, shouldn't it count as anti-Semitism rather than a case of shutting down free speech?
You want me to tackle that first? I'm happy to. So, I think too much of the attention has been put on the idea of safety because it's confusing. I think every student has an absolute right, regardless of whether they're in a protected class or not in the US and elsewhere, to be physically safe, to not be harassed, to not be bullied, to not be discriminated against, to not be intimidated. That's clear. I do not think that students have a right to feel intellectually safe. As a matter of fact, I think if you're on a college campus and you're not disturbed to your core intellectually, you're wasting a lot of money and a lot of time. And I think that distinction is being lost. It was lost in the Senate testimony. It was lost in a lot of the verbiage around that. So, I think the focus should be on that distinction, and you can push back on things that you find deplorable by using your own speech, by using academic freedom. I'm going to give you an example from Bard because there were concerns about some of the verbiage going around. I had a professor friend who said, people are using terms like genocide and Zionism and anti-Zionism, settler colonialism. We're a college. Why don't we have a class? She put together a class. What an idea on a college campus. Not only what these terms mean, but why people are hearing them differently. So I think rather than just definitions to sort of limit speech, how do you use the educational institution exactly what you want to do to teach? In terms of the river to the sea, look, I'm disturbed by that too, but there was a poll that came out in the United States of Jewish students that said 66% of Jewish students hear it exactly as Hamas means it. 14% of Muslim students mean it that way. I know Palestinians who say that phrase and say, well, to them, it means Palestinians will be free from the river to the sea. You know, if you ask David this question, I'm sure he'd point out as an historian that the first Likud platform talked about Jewish sovereignty from the river to the sea. If you ask a Palestinian today, why are we talking about chance there is Jewish sovereignty from river to the sea? It's complicated, but we try to put things into these narrow categories. And what got really awful in the United States was Elise Stefanik saying, well, this means the same as genocide, and shouldn't genocide be a form of discipline? And my response to that, it's awful. It should be denounced. It should be spoken against. But I cited the example of David Duke, who's somebody that we could all agree is an anti-Semite. When he was a student at LSU in the late 60s and early 70s, he advocated all Black people should be sent back to Africa. He advocated all Jews should be exterminated. He actually paraded around campus in a Nazi uniform. I'd like to see him try that in Columbia today. But be that as it may, he wasn't disciplined. And if he had been, he would have loved it because it would have turned into a free speech issue as opposed to condemning the hatred.
I agree with everything Ken has just said. So rather than repeat it, I'll say something else, which is to say we're in a real mess here. And we are in a real, and this is not, as it were, a Jewish problem, a problem in talking about anti-Semitism. It's a problem we have in talking about racism more broadly. And it's a reflection in the Jewish case of the domination of the primacy of a way of thinking about racism, which puts the emphasis, the decisive emphasis, on the feelings, the experience, and the subjectivity of the putative victim. And this is a very dangerous place for us to be, in general, as a society, not only as Jews, because anyone can present themselves as a victim. Anyone can present themselves as feeling unsafe. People with great power and who abuse that power can present themselves as feeling unsafe. This is not saying that this is what is happening in the Jewish case in America or the United States, but simply this should not be the decisive criteria. If Jewish people, Jewish students feel uncomfortable, that needs to be taken seriously. But whether this is regarded as anti-Semitism or not needs to depend on a principled approach and not on subjective feelings. And just to try to hammer home the point, the racist demonstrators at Charlottesville would have been at one in saying that they felt vulnerable in the face of Black people and Jewish people and what they were doing to them. And I hope we can agree what value we should place on those feelings.
So I'm mindful of the clock, and I would again agree with my my colleagues, but I will take this opportunity to just promote the most recent document that Nexus has created, which is it's called a Campus Guide to Identifying Anti-Semitism in a Time of Perplexity. And it focuses on actual vocabulary and asks 3 questions. Does the term, for example, the terms include apartheid, by any means necessary, from the river to the sea, settler colonialism, genocide, lists a series of terms, and it asks in each case, does it promote traditional anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes? Does it promote discrimination, violence, and hostility? Does it conflate Jews with Israel? And, applying that litmus test, I mean, I don't think that we get definitive answers as to whether things are anti-Semitic or terms are anti-Semitic, because again, it's what, as Ken said, it depends on one's point of view, what is intended. I mean, equality from the river to the sea. I mean, Judenfrei from the river to the sea. Very different intentions, but one may intend one thing and it's heard differently and acts accessing that difference only happens if you talk to each other. So that's been my mantra, that we need to have the conversations. Ken advocates classes, but classes are, everything is fraught. Sometimes classes are sites of anti-Semitism. You need to acknowledge that also, because faculty come in with their own subjectivities, their own histories, their own points of view. We are not going to solve it. But we can be a force for conversations that may help us get to better places, and that we shouldn't put handcuffs on people who are doing their best to engage fruitfully. Unmute, Francesca.
Apologize. We reached 1:30, and this was the original endpoint of our webinar. Are you available to stay for 5 more minutes, since we had IT problems at the beginning? Thank you. I'm really grateful. There was I'm trying to pick, we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions in the chat or the Q&A, so I apologize about that. But there are a few themes that seem common. And I want to draw your attention to Sharon Avni's question. In the US, are there other ethnic or religious or racial groups or LGBTQIA or other identity groups that have documents that define what they consider discrimination is? And I would maybe open it broader than the US, in the UK, in Europe. I am asking, as someone who studies discourse about Jewishness, I would also be interested in your thoughts about how you see the Jewish community's tension over these definitions in light of the social turn from what a speaker intends, intentionality, to Lori, to a focus on receptivity, how it is received by the target person. So these are some of the themes we've already touched on, but interesting factual question at the beginning.
Sure, and I'm happy to take the first stab about that. For Title VI purposes, which is where this is played out on the campus in particular, there is no definition that's being used to filter for Title VI complaints of what's a pervasively hostile campus environment. Only the one that's being pushed is the one about anti-Semitism. And when I testified in front of the House in 2017, I said, look, if you came up with a definition of racism that was put together for the same purposes, you could make an argument that there are political examples that you'd want to include to take the temperature: opposition to Black Lives Matter, opposition to removal of Confederate statues, opposition to affirmative action. Each of those might be a legitimate thing if you're taking the temperature. None of them would be things of saying you take this position and you're a racist, but that's how it's being used. And one of the things that I was worried about is, are others going to try to curtail speech in the same way? There was an interesting article, I shared the Senate testimony, it's in a footnote, but there was a thing from the Jewish Journal that said, the pushing of the IHRA definition has led to, in Canada, the creation of a definition of anti-Palestinianism that you might expect would be the flip side of the IHRA one, denying the Palestinians the right to self-determination, denying the Nakba, and so forth. So that's one that's being put up. There's one about Islamophobia that some folks are looking at, but for Title VI purposes, for looking at how we're going to use law, this is the only one, and it shouldn't be there at all.
David, did you want to jump in?
Sure. Well, I'm not qualified to talk about Title VI, but I think the ways in which the IHRA definition is perceived and is perceived to have winds in its sails has had a political effect on other minoritized groups in the United Kingdom. Certainly, Muslims debate and press for a definition of Islamophobia. There are discussions now about definitions of Hindu phobia as well. So this is one possible direction in which it will go. I think the effect very often will be to fragment the struggle against racism, and all the more so when it's allied to conceptions of racism which are based on subjectivity, because then what you will get when the interests of different groups clash, as they do between Jews and Palestinians, you'll get one subjectivity which is pitted against another. You deny my history, you deny my history, and no point outside of that through which to arbitrate. And I fear that is the situation in which we are in at present.
I would underscore David's final point. I don't know the answer to the opening question about how many definitions are circulating among other groups, but I do know that academically there's a rich literature about every variety of racism, and it is it's lifetimes of study that one could engage with. That said, we want to coalition build. We want to be alert to how to hold multiple narratives that are often contradictory or competing with one another, how to teach them, how to allow for the possibility that two things can be true, even if they seem like they can't be true at the same time. And that, I think, is the whole value of an education, is and that's what narrative studies does. I mean, it allows us to see how narrative works, that that access to truth is not simply a collection of all the facts. I mean, there's no cosmic point of view that will get us to truth. And definitions, maybe that's a problem with definitions, is that they seem to pretend to give us access to something that is true. And I don't think that's the case. I think, the act of love is simply to be in the conversation, and where David's saying that to the extent that these things are putting barriers to conversation, then that's the problem. I would also underscore that groups are not comparable, that racism is, and anti-Semitism and anti-Asian and these have separate histories, and the identities of these groups are separate. Are Jews a race? Are they not a race? An ethnicity, a people? And Jewishness in particular is so problematic and has always been problematic to define. And I think that we need to honor not the similarities, this is your definition, my definition, here are the parallels, but rather how utterly not dissimilar these definitions of identity definitions are, and their intersections, and how we are like and unlike ourselves, even within groups. And it is that kind of the kaleidoscopic is really, I think, where we need to live, and appreciate the kaleidoscope. But in the meantime, these are conversations with life and death stakes. And that's really, we're having an academic conversation in a climate here. And I'm alert to the fact that, what's going on around us or outside of us or elsewhere where, we're enjoying the blessings and privileges of being in conversation, are terrifying, but they're not, they are mutually impacting. So yeah, I would just close with that.
Thank you, Lori. The act of love is in the conversation, as you said. So I want to thank you all for a big act of love, the engagement with very complex and difficult themes. I want to thank our public at home. There's a very lively discussion in the chat. Apologies if some of your questions were not addressed live during this webinar. It was recorded. It will be in a few weeks posted to the YouTube channel of the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Center. And I also want to remind you of the sister roundtable that is going to take place on November 1st at 11 a.m. There will be publicity about that, and we will have Pamela Nadell, Ethan Katz, and Avi Pat discussing the implications of these definitions and their repercussions on campus free speech. So thank you all. Thank you so much, Ken, David, Lori, for, I think, what was a most interesting and thoughtful discussion. Again, thank you for this act of love. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.